This is Raphael.
I'm Loryn.
We're the Pacheco siblings, and welcome to the Hypercube podcast, a talk show in which two siblings converse about anything and everything. So, welcome back for season 2.
Back at it.
Oh my goodness, it's been a while. It's been a long while.
It's been a while.
We said we were taking a hiatus, but it ended up being a big hiatus. But
That's how hiatuses work.
fair. But we did say we were going to be back when we were ready, and evidently we are ready. Our noggins are so full of things we want to talk about, and it probably doesn't help that I think we're like a little pent up because we haven't been in as like regular a contact as we normally are this last year, and so it's just like I think we have all sorts of ideas.
There's no like release valve.
yeah, we have all sorts of ideas that we're ready to deep dive on that we haven't really had proper exhaust port for. So we're actually starting with a pretty exciting episode that I've been looking forward to for a while, which is we're talking about our creative heroes to premiere season 2. And this is something that we've been talking about since season 1 and one that we've kind of been wanting to do. But I think it is a proper and fitting way to open this new season to kind of, I don't know, sort of delve into our identities creatively, where they come from, what our roots are.
Our creative identities.
Yeah. And I think it's a very interesting exploration of how somebody thinks of themselves artistically to kind of know who they consider their own influences. And I think that's always an interesting thing to find out about artists. And I think it'll be an interesting way to sort of define ourselves as artists, at least as we stand now, because who knows, these are lists that may be ephemeral and change in the future, but at least to our current formation, who do we consider the important figures? And because that's something that I've, after giving some thought over the course of many years, narrowed down to 4 individuals that I can name as my
individual people.
Yeah, individual people, artists who I can name as my creative heroes who had the biggest influence on me. And now for you, I think you're doing it a little bit differently, right?
Because I was initially going to do the same thing as you and narrow it down to individual people. However, I realized the people were less important than the field that they were in that influenced me as an artist. And I realized there are several people that kind of like lead me in a trajectory to kind of fall in love with a particular artistic field, that I realize all of that together, I would consider all those individuals to be my heroes, if I were to call any of those people heroes. But really, it's a type of person that I consider to be my hero.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So you're kind of going by broader categories, but you're still going to be talking about individuals here. And so I think
I will talk about the people who brought me to those, to bring me to those conclusions.
Yeah. For me, I kind of think in the same sort of terms. However, I condensed those categories down into individuals because these certainly aren't the only 4 that influenced me.
Yeah.
However, if I had to take all of those sort of categories and fields and condense them down into representatives, these would be probably the biggest ones. And for different reasons. So,
and to be fair, I probably could do that with 2 of my field heroes, my creative field heroes. But with one of them, there's definitely a whole bunch of people that all equally, for different reasons, I would have to consider them individually as opposed to just one.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited and curious to see who makes your list. But I think should I establish at the top who all is on mine just to give kind of an overview and then before we go into each of them individually?
That's a good idea. I think we should list our people, then talk about them in a little bit more depth afterwards. Yeah. It's a good idea.
So my 4 creative heroes, and of course, I'm using that term. I suppose we should probably define it. Basically, not necessarily to like hold them up as like super heroic people, although I think some of them are. But
some of them might be a little bit super heroic.
Yeah, but in the sense that these are the individuals, kind of like we were establishing earlier, that have most influenced us creatively and are kind of the roots of our creative journey and identities that we could trace early influences to in our formation as wanting to be creative and wanting to be artists. So that being said, my 4 all-time creative heroes. would be
All time.
in the order that they influenced me.
In the order. Oh.
Yeah, in the order, not the in
Mine is in no particular order.
yeah, I will list them in the order that they influenced me, just to give it some sort of structure. Stan Lee, Monty Ohm, Orson Welles, and C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
What have you got?
I have. So I'll talk about the individuals within each category later, but my categories of people who are my creative heroes are magicians, martial artists / kung fu artists, I guess, because I realize there's somebody in there who isn't technically a martial artist, but is definitely a kung fu in the actual term of kung fu practitioner, not a wushu practitioner, a kung fu practitioner, somebody who excels in their one thing. And then, of course, filmmakers.
Yes. All right. Well, those are very interesting categories. And again, I'm very curious who individually you're going to talk about within those. But I suppose I can start us off in diving in with my first one, which would be Stan Lee. And this is actually kind of an interesting pick because obviously I think comic books and superheroes in general were superhero fiction, were very formative to us in our youth. But that being said, I think it's fair also to say that a majority of the comic book writers that I've read are not Stan Lee, right? Like he just simply was not of the era in which we were kind of being reared into comics. And so it's just like, why does he make my list though? Well, because I think what I've engaged with, I realize, is the legacy of Stan Lee. And I think that's ultimately more important than his actual body of work, because the legacy of Stan Lee is huge, right? He is
much bigger than any individual comic artist for sure. Yeah. Like even as like from any part of comics, from writer to illustrator, everybody knows who Stan Lee is. Yeah.
He left his mark on the industry in a profound way. And even if I haven't, which I have read a lot of the actual things he's written, but you know, obviously a majority of what I've read is not what he's written. And arguably the ones that are most formative to me are not from his writing. However, again, he still laid the groundwork for all of those artists to come. Yeah. And I think there's something that is profound and recognizable about that, but not only like the groundwork in the industry, although he certainly did that, right? He made a space for comic book industry and brought it into mainstream popularity in a way that it had never been before, which it was still pretty, mainstream popular, but he kind of elevated it to another level.
Yeah.
And so not only was it that, but the industry aspect, but just creatively, he kind of laid the template for telling superhero stories in a more human way that then became the norm for everyone on all parts of the industry, not just at Marvel. And although arguably I would argue that Marvel still does it best in following those footsteps. However, it is much more of a standard for everyone in the post-Stan Lee world. And that, I think, really, really influenced me, is his approach, his ideology about telling comic book superhero stories, right? The fact that he did want to make a conscious effort to humanize them. And even though my childhood imagination, I think, had an obvious, how should I say, kind of immature affinity for comic books and for superheroes, like most children do, right? There's an obvious fantasy to them. The fantasy,
power fantasy.
Yeah, the power fantasy draw is very obvious, that I think on like a reptile brain level really attracts young people to it. And obviously it did. I think as a kid, I did have that affinity for it. But I think on a deeper level, there is also the fact that, like, why that stands out as kind of a gold standard as far as methodologies to approaching superhero stories is because of that fact, because it was humanized and because he kind of established a way of telling human stories and that are grounded with larger than life, super heroic, super powered characters. And that legacy has kind of just had ripple effects everywhere ever since. And then, of course, superhero films were just huge impact on us growing up. I remember the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, obviously. I think we watched that so many times as children. And it was just like that stuff. And I still remember it, like how deeply it affected some of my earliest fiction writing too. Those Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, like the visuals and just the imagination of it just really enthralled me. And I remember trying to like emulate a lot of that in some of my early storytelling.
Yeah.
And so, but all of that is just like, again, ripple effects of the groundwork that Stan Lee laid back in the golden age of comics. And so I think that's why he secures a spot on this list, even if his direct work isn't the majority of what I've engaged with in the comics and superhero worlds. But needless to say, superhero storytelling in general has been a huge influence to us. We really loved that stuff and still do to a lesser extent, but it was definitely very formative in our early engagement with stories.
Very formative.
Yeah, like that's kind of what probably the earliest thing that I got really, like the earliest form of storytelling that I got really geeky about. And I think Stan Lee definitely gets a lot of credit for that.
I realize now that you've mentioned Stan Lee and gone into it, I think my filmmakers category needs to be expanded because I completely forgot about comic books. And how, just how completely, like how that just consumed a lot of my early idea of how stories were told. And I took a lot of that into how I consider like filmmakers to be good storytellers. So I think I should change filmmakers to be in general storytellers. But I think that's way too general because filmmakers is very specific. And there is a reason I have filmmakers there.
Yeah.
But there is, I realize though, there is also a comic book artist that has also influenced me greatly that does not fit into any of these categories. And that would be Alan Moore. And I can't fit Alan Moore into filmmakers. Like he has done films, but he's more so like a comic book artist that has made that there have been movies that have been made of his comics. Yeah. You know, in the same way. Stan Lee's like could also be considered filmmaker as well, but not really. Yeah.
Well, I guess you could probably throw an honorable mention then for Alan Moore and others under that section then. Yeah. But let's hear first.
We'll bring him in at the end of it.
Yeah. So your first category you mentioned was magicians. Yeah. Would you want to start with
magicians? Oh my goodness. So freaking magicians are absolutely like by far some of my most influential people when it comes to me as like a creative person, because at the heart of it, creativity it's not lying per se, which is something that I'm very good at, but it is a kind of deception, right?
Right.
Fiction is a kind of deception, especially like, or even nonfiction.
You're getting into the territory of Orson Welles here. Like I said, I watched F for Fake in preparation for this. Yeah. And this is basically the whole like subject matter of that documentary. And interestingly, like I said, he frames it a lot through the lens of magic too. Yeah. And for sure. It's kind of interesting. There's actually a quote from that I actually wanted to share with you, and I'll just insert it here before you get into your magician talk.
Hit me.
From apparently there's he cites this quote, which apparently is a pretty well-known quote from a classic like old-time illusionist named Robert Houdin, I believe is how it's said, but it's a longer French name, which I would no doubt butcher the pronunciation of. But apparently, apparently he famously said, "A magician is just an actor playing the part of a magician." Yeah. And apparently that had a big impact on Orson Welles, no doubt. But it's like, that is very true in a sense. It is very
it's all performance.
Yeah, it's all performance. Yeah. And he talked about kind of that veil between lies and truth and, the deception and illusion and the inherent trickery of storytelling.
Yeah. I don't remember if this was in The Prestige. It might have been, but there's another quote that has deeply influenced me, and which might just be a general magician quote. But I think it was in Prestige actually. It's no, this was V for Vendetta apparently. Alan Moore.
There you go, Alan Moore again.
Apparently it was at least in V for Vendetta. But again, I'm not sure what the origin of it is. But artists use lies to tell the truth, because. The truth can be told in basically just, if you want to tell the truth, there is one way to tell the truth, and that's to tell it. However, there are more than one experience in the world. And by shrouding the truth in storytelling, in fiction, in fantasy, we can reach more experiences. And magicians basically do that for a living, is shrouding the truth in lies. And I'll start going over the individuals now, but magicians by far have been a huge influence on me as a creative person. Just in general, magicians are my heroes. So going way back, David Blaine was the first magician that I ever saw and was like, oh, this is a thing, right? Magic. It was David Blaine's street magic special. Our cousin showed me it and I was like, whoa, this is weird. This is interesting. Like, this guy's doing like really cool tricks just out in the public. And he was kind of the first person to bring street magic into popularity. Before it's basically had all been stages. You had to go to a magician to see magic. And this guy was bringing magic to you. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. He's breaking that barrier, right? And so I was like, okay, this is interesting. This is new. I'm interested. Reel me in. And he started me on my journey as a consumer of magic. And then you get like people like Chris Angel, Penn and Teller as well, where I was watching magic as a consumer. But it wasn't until I started watching Penn and Teller that they started breaking down the tricks, talking about the psychology behind it, how we get fooled, why we as humans like to believe certain things, especially the things that we see, and how our biases influence how we interpret events that we see, right? So like, okay, so there's something deeper than this. It's not just really cool effects. It's not just a puzzle for me to solve. How did the card get from one place to another? How did the coins multiply from 1 to 10 or whatever? It wasn't just a puzzle for me to solve anymore. There's a reason behind it. There's a human drive for us to want to be fooled. And that's interesting. So now I'm on my journey to become a student of magic. And then I start to find all these people from way back in the day, actually not way back, like maybe 100 years ago, who brought magic into what it is now as a performance art, as a philosophy of art. Because magic for a long time wasn't thought of as like theater. It was a lot of artists of magic were scoundrels and thieves, and they used sleight of hand to trick people into giving them money or to get power or to do all this other stuff that was not necessarily thought of as a good thing, right?
Right. They're con men.
Even worse than that, it were people who tried to convince others that these tricks that they can do elevated them above everybody else. These people were the faith healers. They were the charlatans who would come in and say, look at me, I am elevated above you. Follow me. I can cure you of ailments. I can give you riches beyond your wildest dreams because I can do these minor parlor tricks. And because there wasn't a set of people whose job was to do that same thing for entertainment, a lot of that knowledge of how these things were done weren't out in the public. Then you get people like Di Vernon, Ricky Jay, and the Amazing Randy. These three people changed how I looked at magic. Di Vernon, he was basically like the godfather of modern magic. He founded the Magic Circle, or the Magic Castle in Hollywood, which is a fantastic, it's Hollywood.
The venue,
that's where you go. That's where you go when you've made it as a magician. I think he also did the Magic Circle, which is kind of like an inner circle of magicians. You think of magicians, especially think of your stereotypical magician. They got their nicknames, right? It's like you have the Amazing Randy, you have blah blah blah, the Great, or the Wondrous, right? You know what his nickname was?
What?
The Professor.
Oh, the Professor.
That tells you immediately what kind of a magician he was. He was a scientist of deceit and cards, basically, because he perfected how we think about card magic. And he invented a routine, which is basically like a super, super simple routine that we think of now. Every beginner magician learns this, called the ambitious card routine. You pick a card, it could be any card, have them sign it, doesn't matter. And that card returns to the top of the deck every time, right? Very simple trick. When he showed it to Houdini, fooled him 3 times in a row.
Wow.
And he became known as the man who fooled Houdini. So I was like, coming in from it now, I was like, oh yeah, I know how to do those tricks. And it's like, it's not the trick that's important. It's how you perform it and how you do it, because he would frame it as, hey, here's this card, I'm going to bring it to the top of the deck, there it is. And Houdini said, show it to me again, let me see if I can catch it. So he said, okay, I'll do it again for you, this time slower, right? And he'll do a technically different trick with the same effect. The card would come to the top. And Houdini, having seen it once, was looking for something that he can see that would let him in to know how that first trick was done, not knowing he was looking at a different trick. And Houdini said, okay, hold on, show it to me again, let me see if I can get it. He said, okay, I'll do it again, but slower. And he'll do a third different trick. With the same effect. The card still comes to the top. And so Houdini was fooled 3 times in a row by what he would think of as the same trick, even though it's 3 tricks with the same effect. And that was something that really kind of resonated with me, because the effect is what the audience thinks about, not how it's done.
Yeah. Nobody cares how the sausage gets made, only that it's good.
Yeah. Only that there is a sausage on their plate. Ricky J was a student of Dai Vernon, and he was a historian and archivist of magic. He was primarily interested in the history of the charlatans and the foolers, people who would go out and use these tricks, right? And he has a fantastic special called The 52 Assistants, or Ricky J and his 52 Assistants, 52 being the cards in a deck. And the whole thing is it's like an hour of the history of how humans fool each other. It is brilliant. I recommend it to anybody who is interested in storytelling, in deceit, in sleight of hand, and tomfoolery and trickery. It is beautiful. It's basically a culmination of his research into the art of magic and deception. And he, of course, he is a fantastic performer in a very strange kind of way, because normally if you're a performer, you go out and perform, right? And of course he did. He something like he was performing since the age of 6, kind of thing. Like he just, like, magic was in his bones. But he's the kind of person who would lock himself away in a room for like months, practicing one trick to himself in a mirror. So just surrounded by mirrors, just to be able to make sure that from every angle he was covered, practicing it by himself. Then go out and just be the best at that trick, just the absolute best.
Just absolute monk-like persistence.
Just pure dedication. Yeah, probably was on the spectrum, but he was that kind of performer. Discovering him and his archival nature of approaching magic and magicians, that brought me into contact with a bunch of other magicians and types of magicians who came before, who weren't necessarily performers. They were performing, but they weren't performers. They weren't there for entertainment. They were there for like nefarious reasons, which is what leads me to the Amazing Randy. The Amazing Randy was a stage magician. He was an escape artist. He was a pretty good magician as well, but not more importantly, but he was more known as being a profound skeptic of the paranormal. And he was vocal about modern charlatans who were using very basic tricks, like very basic, simple magician's tricks that you can like walk into any magic shop, buy a book off the shelf and say, oh, so that's how this person fooled me into giving up my life savings in Morocco off of a psychic surgery.
Right.
Very simple stuff. And he would go on TV shows. He would like publicly call out these psychics, and I don't know what to call them, because like the only thing that they could do was like there was a very particular person, Uri Geller, whose whole thing was like, I guess he was some kind of connected to metal, I guess. And he could bend spoons. Spoon bending is a very, very simple trick. It's old as heck. But he was like, no, yeah, like that's a simple trick. I can do it. Everybody can do it.
I did.
If you just spent a couple. Yeah, right. You bent your spoon in ice cream earlier.
I did it accidentally while trying to scoop ice cream. It was very, very hard and cold ice cream.
Yes. So the Amazing Randy would call these people out in public and just say, hey, if you can prove to me under scientific conditions that you have paranormal or supernatural abilities, I will concede that you have paranormal or psychic abilities. However, until then, you are a hoax and a con artist, and you are scamming people out of hard-earned money, especially psychics who pretend to talk to the spirits of the dead beyond the grave and say, for a wee sum of half of your life savings, I will tell your mother how she feels about you, or I'll tell you how your mother feels about you from the grave.
Right.
That just,
yeah,
just terrible stuff.
Oh yeah.
He was my he got me into the idea of skepticism, but also using your art as a way to inoculate yourself against false claims, basically.
Right. Yeah, it was a bit, and I think that kind of gets into a little bit of the, I guess, didactic nature, perhaps, of what we're into nowadays too, right? Of being both an artist and an educator of your art. And I feel like that's kind of part of that. And I suppose that probably feeds into some later magicians like Penn and Teller that you kind of get into. Okay.
Yeah, and Penn and Teller have famously said, or Penn specifically, because Teller doesn't talk, but Penn, he's been well quoted of saying the Amazing Randy is the reason Penn and Teller is who they are today, like as an act, because he took the idea that Randy was putting out there, the idea of being the skeptic, the idea of being the performer who was calling out BS using the tricks of their own trade, and making a career out of it, basically.
Wow, yeah.
And Penn and Teller, that's basically their whole shtick now, is they are the modern version of the Amazing Randy, at least to the public, of saying, hey, this stuff that you're seeing, these claims that people are making are basic parlor tricks. We'll show you how to do it.
While also just being excellent craftsmen at their thing.
Excellent craftsmen, yeah.
Yeah. So,
and of course, tons of magicians that I haven't mentioned that are all throughout history. But these 5 are the key cornerstones of what make me the artist that I am today, basically.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to have to pick up the pace a little bit to get through the rest of our list. But heading into the next one.
Don't worry. That was by far the longest one.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
Everything else is much shorter, significantly.
Also, just want to throw out there, apologies to our listeners if you catch any background noise making it through on my end. I am in a bit of a temporary living situation in the months until my wedding. So that's exciting. But also,
very exciting.
Temporary living situation is on a main street. So there's only going to be so much we can do as we record this season of the podcast, but we'll make do. So next on my list is one that I think was pretty influential to both of us, and that would be Monty Ohm.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like I said, kind of going in the order that they influenced me in, right? Like Stan Lee, definitely getting into like superheroes and comic books, that was kind of childhood. And I think Monty Ohm is a solid representation of what I was getting into in adolescence, I think. And
definitely, yeah.
And which, to be fair, a very adolescent appeal, right? Like he pretty much had like the sum appeal of what was appealing of a lot of the stylized action of the 90s and early 2000s.
90s rule of cool.
Yeah, rule of cool stuff. But Monty Ohm, for those who don't know, was a web-based animator, 3D animator, who made a lot of awesome fan animations that went viral in the early 2000s. And
like hyper choreographed, very stylized.
Super stylized, over-the-top action stuff, and was later kind of more properly worked in the industry, and most notably was the lead animator for Rooster Teeth for a number of years until his untimely death in his early 30s. So, which was very tragic, and I still remember when it happened, and it was just a severe allergic reaction during what was supposed to be a routine medical procedure. So, but kind of like some other people that have really influenced us, we accomplished a lot in a very short life, and I feel like also on my list of creative heroes, I feel like not only the work, but the artists themselves are also what lend themselves to landing on my list. And the lifestyle they led, the character that they possessed, the personality, I think, and who they were and how they were as an artist and as a person also kind of was what made me gravitate to a lot of these people. Like with Stan Lee, for example, obviously he led a very public life, but his character, to my perception, was very exemplary. And, he wasn't perfect. Obviously, he had some conflicts with some of his fellow artists. And there was obviously a lot of controversy with, him and Jack Kirby and some of the other artists who also deserve just as much credit as him. Ditko, the ones who deserve just as much credit as him for creating the most iconic characters of their careers. But he made every effort to mend those relationships, and was, it just so happened that basically he became the most famous because he was the most outward, public personality. He just had the charisma for that. Face. Yeah, he was just the face of the company whenever they needed one. But he was, from everything that we can tell and every private thing we hear about him, between people who worked with him, he just had a kindness and a character that was very admirable. And he was apparently every bit as wholesome as he seemed. And with Monty was a whole different kind of character. He was very eccentric, we should say, but had a very strong sense of like his identity and style. And he is basically every bit as cool as you would expect somebody who made the cool kinds of animations he made to be, right? Like he very much lived up to the persona that you would expect of his animation style. But like he had, was known for his extraordinary, can we call it a work ethic? His
unhealthy work ethic.
Unhealthy work ethic. Yeah, certainly. Like he was very known for not sleeping and creating vast amounts of animation in short periods of time. And
like, not even that, just like he would be working on an animation and have an idea for something completely different. Stop. Work on that other thing, finish it.
Yeah.
And then
I'll never forget that anecdote that Bernie Burns once gave of Monty, where he was like working on Red versus Blue, and they were getting close to a deadline.
There's a tight deadline.
Yeah, and Bernie's like, Monty, we need to get these shots done. He's like, oh yeah, don't worry about it, I'll get it done. And then next time he checks in on Monty, he's like, Monty, do you have those shots done? He's like, no, but I made like this little robotic
robot.
Yeah, robotic angel figure. And look, its wings articulate. And then he shows him. He's just like, okay, that's great, Monty, but we need those shots. And it gets to like the night before the deadline. He checks back in on Monty. And he checks back in on Monty, and Monty's like asleep at his desk, but he has all the rendered files for all the shots they needed ready for him. Yeah. That was just the way this man operated. But yeah, so Monty, quite the character. But yeah, like there was still something just very admirable about his kind of just go for it attitude. He was not formally trained in his craft. He was not very well educated, but he kind of came of age in this internet generation and kind of carved out a niche for himself with a very distinct style. And that style is still something that I think is just one of the coolest things. It's super fun to watch. It's very stylized. The choreography is impeccable, and it is just an over-the-top style of action that I feel like really perfected the style of action of the generation that influenced him. And it's, this combination of like Hong Kong style martial arts action with like over-the-top video game character-based action with, 90s and 2000s action and martial arts movies. It's just this amalgam of all of his influences and all of his heroes all boiled into a just very distinct stew
a creative stew,
action craziness. Creative stew of character-based action craziness, and it's just absolutely stunning to watch still to this day.
It is eye candy.
Actually, with my fiance, I went through Red versus Blue seasons 6 through 10 to show her that, and it's amazing how well it still holds up just from a pure action design standpoint. And even if maybe some of the animation is a bit dated, but like for what they accomplished on their budget for what they had, I think really what you come away with is the ideas and the action design, and those still hold up extremely well. And the cinematography and everything is just great visual storytelling in the action and in the animation.
It holds up because of how well, like, the fundamental action design behind all of it holds up, because it's character based. There's clear goals and there's clear, like, everybody has clear power levels that you can watch and understand how everybody interacts with each other in a ways that you would expect them to.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, it really felt like a distillation and a perfection of that formula. And just his commitment and his ability and skill in his craft, while also, again, being like pretty much entirely self-taught, was something that kind of left a mark on me and left an impression on the kind of autodidactic way that I've always approached the arts, right? You know, like I'm a college dropout myself, so never really completed a lot of formal education, but like that never really stopped us from telling stories before, and kind of doesn't into the future. And his whole approach is still something that is inspiring to me, really, when I look back and I think about it, and that he developed within his brief lifetime such a distinctive voice and such a distinctive style that you can recognize when you see it immediately. There's something powerful about that. But also he showed me how to be a great action storyteller as well. Yeah. Which is something that I still aspire to, because I love action films. And contrary to popular belief, I don't think it's a purely lowbrow medium or genre, I should say.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
It's something that has vast storytelling potential. And I think people like Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung, and I think in our generation, Monty Oum really tapped into that potential and really approached their craft in an artful and deliberate way that is just absolutely stunning to see in motion. And he did it in a way, though, that was only possible through animation, right? His stuff would have been like near impossible to do in live action. Not impossible, because I think he was obviously largely inspired by Yuen Woo-ping. And I think Yuen Woo-ping's 90s movies get close to basically creating a live action picture of basically what he does with animation. But he played to his strengths of his medium and what he had access to and what resources were available to him as, you know, somebody who's just, you know, on the internet and just staying at home doing what he does. And there's still something kind of inspiring about that. It is the same sort of inspiring nature of what's special about us who came of age in the internet generation, which is the fact that art has been democratized. Anybody with an internet connection and some few basic tools of whatever your medium of choice is can create and can gain an audience and can discover your voice and your style and do what you want without that studio oversight or whatever processes you used to have to go through in order to create. And there's a beauty to that. And Monty was really what kind of exemplified that. And I really think he was a fine example of an artist that was taken from us too soon. I think he had a lot more to give the world creatively. But I think, and sadly, you know, I do have some issues with the way a lot of his legacy has been handled with his unfinished projects. However, the fact still remains that the work that he did get done, however few it might be, are still endlessly revisitable and no doubt are going to continue to inspire me for the rest of my life as an action storyteller.
Yeah, for sure. Like Monty Oum, I need to add him to my list, but again, he didn't really fit in anywhere. So I was like, okay.
Yeah, well, I feel like he fits in your martial artist category to some extent, or your filmmaker category.
He would most fit into my filmmakers category, but like the reason I would put him in there, it would be because of his just raw work ethic. And I was like, I don't have work ethic as an artist category.
Well, although he certainly had a kung fu, you could say.
He did have a kung fu. Actually, that's true. Now that you mentioned it, looking at my martial artist kung fu category, primarily what I like about them is their work ethic and how they approach their practice. So maybe, actually, no, he would probably go under my martial artist, my kung fu section. So let's throw him in there as an honorable mention, Monty Oum.
There you go. But we added a couple honorable mentions to your list over the course of this. Let's go. So martial artist then. Let's get into that. I feel like that's a perfect segue that I've set you up for. Let's
very, very deliberately, of course. Yes. So obviously, I'm very big. Well, I was going to say I'm a very big athlete, but I'm also a very big person. I am an athlete, and that makes me a very big person.
That is fair. You are a large person.
I am a very large person. I am large and only very sometimes in charge. But yeah, my body is a tool that I have used for art, and I appreciate people who have taken that tool, their bodies, and have pushed it to the next level. And those people I have listed under martial artists or kung fu artists. Kung fu meaning, the practice of something to the extent of it becoming like a spiritual practice, right? And
that's the original definition of
the original definition.
Not
and of course
through mistranslations in Asian movies
and cultural
and subtitles and dubs. We kind of come to associate it with martial arts, but in the original sense of the term, kung fu was basically any skill that, like you said, is practiced to a high degree and extent to the point of becoming basically a spiritual practice for that person.
A spiritual practice. And like you were saying, it's through mistranslations, people would say, oh, this is my kung fu, and practice their wushu. But the translation, the subtitles would make it appear as if they were saying, this thing that I am now doing is called kung fu.
Yeah, because we don't have a clear English equivalent of that word.
So obviously I have to have Bruce Lee in there, because as a person who has a work ethic, his is the work ethic,
which in many ways I feel like Monty Ohm was an inheritor of that work ethic.
And
I feel
which then became us, and
pretty much. But that's the reason why Monty Ohm could have been interchangeable with Bruce Lee for me on that point on my list for sure.
The only reason I had Bruce Lee on here is because man was a machine.
He was a machine.
He took his work ethic. Of course, Monty had his own movement practices that he would do as well. He was an excellent dancer. He had full control of his body, which was amazing. But Bruce Lee was a freaking machine. His body was a finely honed tool, which he used to express his martial prowess as well as just like pure athleticism. You have all like the tall tales of how Bruce Lee trained, right? Of just the ways he would push his body to the absolute limits, which unfortunately kind of, it's not the best. It's not healthy.
It's certainly not.
You can only do that for so long before your body gives out. And I feel like, again, and then you have Monty Ohm who comes in after that, right? Who inherited that kind of legacy of just pushing yourself too much. We come in and we learn from these people saying, oh, so that's how you do it, and push ourselves. And we've been pushing ourselves constantly, developing an unhealthy work ethic, which is something that I've been thinking about lately. Is just how unhealthy my work ethic is for a lot of different reasons. Maybe something I'll get into later. But Bruce Lee in there, martial artist, kung fu artist, pushed his body to the absolute limits. Of course, in general martial artists, I also have people like Jackie Chan and Donnie Yen. Jackie Chan just like his pure athleticism, like his ability to just do things. Like watching, like way back in the day, watching the Rush Hour films was unfortunately one of my first few interactions with Jackie Chan before I really got into studying him.
That hard Hong Kong stuff.
Yeah, the hard Hong Kong stuff. But still, like the stuff that he was doing with his body, like, diving through like tiny metal grates, just like things that they would find in the scene. And it's like, hey, Jackie, can you fit through that? It's like, yeah, sure. Let me dive through it really quick. And his use of like the natural environment that he would throw into his choreography. It's just, it elevated my idea of what a human being could do. Just on Earth, on the planet, a human being living in a space. These are the things that you can do. And of course, his choreography style is just fantastic. And probably was a big component of my love of comedy. Like really, I think Jackie Chan is why I like action comedy and having little comedic moments in very serious type of things. Like martial arts is very serious. You get punched in the face, it hurts. But when you watch Jackie Chan, you can't help but laugh, knowing that the things that are happening on screen are physically hurting the characters. There's a kind of, I don't know, like dark comedy to it, if you will. But adding that little bit of comedic element to it, I've stuck with that. I think through everything that I've made, I've always added a little bit of a ironic twist or a comedic type of punchline to anything that I make. Yeah,
and it's the physical comedy too, especially, which is a very unique subgenre of comedy that I feel like you have an affinity for.
Yeah, and because I didn't realize it at the time, but now that I have the term for it, he was a clown, a proper vaudevillian clown. He studied the likes of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, which also under here as well as kung fu artists, right? Maybe also filmmakers, but they understood how They probably fit them in later, but they understood how to use their bodies to tell stories because they were in silent film. They couldn't talk. They couldn't use dialogue. So what did they do? They used their bodies to tell dialogue, and they used the environment and they used other actors in relation to each other to tell their dialogue, which was just masterful storytelling and masterful use of, physical, let's just call it nonverbal communication, right?
Right.
Which then Jackie Chan turned it into a martial arts version of nonverbal communication. Most of the time, arguing is what that would translate to. But yeah, these people as martial artists, it absolutely inspired me just to be a better athlete, but also as storytellers, using that martial art to tell stories. In here as well, I'm going to have David Bell, which is why I realized I needed to make it not martial artists, but kung fu people. Because David Bell, again, insane work ethic. His body is also a machine, but he can fight, and we've seen him fight in film, but that's not what he does. What he does is essentially CrossFit, like just an old school, the original version of CrossFit. His dad was a military, I don't remember what his rank was, but he developed a fitness program for the military, and they used that to train the military. And he was like, wait, I can turn that and make it fun. So yeah, David Bell's in there as well. Absolute
invented parkour,
absolute icon of a Frenchman.
yeah
And
brilliant artist athlete.
Absolutely brilliant artist.
Does that complete your martial artists / kung fu practitioners list?
Indeed.
All right. Yeah. So those are definitely some great picks. And yeah, you mentioned Donnie Yen briefly, and I feel like, that definitely deserves mention because that dude is the absolute beast.
Yeah. Just look at him when he was 20, when he was 18, like,
oh yeah.
I
mean, everybody else was a machine, but I feel like he just kind of came out of the womb that way. He definitely had a lot of natural advantages.
Yeah, he definitely had a lot of natural advantages because of just the amount of like just high quality genes that were in his favor.
Yeah.
His whole family is like champions, like wushu champions.
Yeah, man's insane. But incredibly fast and really pretty revolutionarily creative as a action director too. Ways that we could get into perhaps in another podcast.
Yeah, for sure. He kind of brought the Hong Kong style to MMA.
Yeah, or vice versa.
Or, that's what I meant. Correct. He brought MMA to the Hong Kong style and really showed like what the Hong Kong style can do with modern fighting technique.
Yeah. And just brilliant choreographer, director.
Yeah.
Kind of moving then quickly towards our final ones then.
It's okay. My last one's very simple.
Orson Welles would be next on my list.
Yeah.
Orson Welles, I could do a whole deep dive on Orson Welles, but I think this isn't the podcast.
I would want you to. I want you to, because the more I hear about you talking about Orson Welles, the more I want to know about this guy.
Oh yeah. So fascinating human being.
He sounds like he'd be my jam.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He's definitely, there's a number of filmmakers I could have chosen to kind of slot into, I think, this category of my creative heroes. However, because Orson Welles isn't necessarily my favorite director, probably top 5 for sure, but like not necessarily my favorite, right? There are other directors I could cite whose just body of work I love way more, right? Like Christopher Nolan or David Fincher, right? Other more contemporary artists who have really inspired me as a filmmaker. However, right, if I'm taking the holistic account, as I've been doing, right, of looking at the whole, not only body of work, but the lives of the artists themselves, Orson Welles is really one that kind of resonates with me most as a person, which isn't to say I agree with everything he says. He certainly has a lot of strong opinions. But that's the thing is, as you and I know, I think we both have this in common. We respect people who have strong opinions and a strong intellect with which to defend it.
Yeah. If you don't have a strong opinion, I question you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like, no matter what someone's opinion is, if they have a strong opinion and they're well reasoned in it, you can't help but respect it. And even if you don't agree with it, that's always kind of been my policy. And Orson Welles definitely fits into that category, but I was kind of doing a little bit more research to brush up on his life story kind of leading into this. And again, I won't get into all of it here, but the more I learn about Orson Welles, the more I also kind of recognize that he was probably a genius. Like, I don't know any other way of putting it.
For sure.
Like there's some people, and I don't use that word lightly. In fact, I use it very infrequently, deliberately, because I think it's very prone to hyperbole. However, I really can't think of any other explanation for how Orson Welles ended up the way that he is. I'm pretty sure he was like an actual genius who happened that way. Like we've encountered plenty of geniuses throughout history that have been very influential. You know, you've got your Oppenheimers, your Einsteins, all of these great geniuses. But I feel like he's just like that caliber of genius who just decided to become an artist instead, right? That's like what it looks like. And because the thing is, he clearly had a brilliant knack for the arts and for all of the arts, like anything he put his hand to, right? Whether it be magic, filmmaking, acting, writing. He apparently painting was like one of his earliest art forms, which never made a career out of that, but that was a start. You know, and poetry, all sorts of things. Like he was just the ultimate polymath of art and absolutely brilliant at it. And when you hear him talk too, his style of conversation, his mannerisms, the way he could articulate himself with high verbal fluency, like he honestly sounds like just like a well-educated Englishman, you know, when you hear him talk, except with an American accent. And it's just like, where did this guy come from? Like, I'm genuinely convinced he must have just been a genius, because he was pretty prodigal from a pretty early age too. And as I learned more about him, though, I feel like there's also some kinship, I suppose, with our own life story. The more I realized that, too, because I was like, okay, where does that come from? And you and I have often observed that like trauma matures people very fast.
Yes.
And because people, and especially people with rough childhoods, tend to grow up faster, right? Because by necessity. Yeah. And because so apparently he was like basically an independent adult by the time he was like 10 years old. So there was a lot of so there was a lot of stuff in his childhood that was not easy. Even though he came from a wealthy family, he did not have a very stable or easy childhood. And I think a lot of that contributes to his quick maturity, but also then the quick, you know, transition into becoming like a full-time working artist. Like apparently after his dad died, he used his inheritance, because his dad was a very wealthy businessman. He used his inheritance to just travel Europe in his late teens, and literally got his first acting job in Ireland by wandering. Well, he was doing like a walking tour of Ireland, he got a wagon and a like horse or a donkey or something, and just was going around trying to sell his paintings and just living out of his wagon. He was pretty much nomadic and homeless for that period, and extremely wealthy because of his inheritance. But when that all ran out, he wandered into a theater in Dublin and convinced the casting director that he was a Broadway star from New York. And that's how he got his first acting job. Right? So it's like, that is just the kind of person Orson Welles is. He is just an instinctive storyteller. In this case, you know, read liar, but like just an instinctive storyteller, right? And
a weaver of tales,
a weaver of tall tales. And it's just in his DNA. There's something in him that needs to tell stories. And that's how he got into acting. And then of course he had a very profitable theater career in Ireland, and then he eventually ran out of money and career options and had to return stateside, and then just continued to just be a smash hit theater actor and director in the United States. Founded his own eventually because he started doing theater under a federal theater program that came out of World War II, right? It was like a New Deal sort of thing to kind of incentivize the arts. And he used that, but he was doing radio at the same time, and he was making so much money at radio drama, which was a medium he very much helped pioneer. And he was making so much money at radio drama, right? There's the famous War of the Worlds fiasco that he created. I say created, orchestrated very deliberately. Again, always a weaver of tales, always getting himself into trouble. And but yeah, he orchestrated that thing, but it led to a very profitable radio career that was alongside his theater career, and he basically funded a lot of his theater projects using that money. And he was, like a lot of people on my list, evidently, very much a workaholic who can be quoted as saying during that period, like, had so much work that he forgot how to sleep.
Right, of course.
Yeah. And so, but he was very prolific. And that's the thing, had this just very, go get him attitude, not very, like, if you hear him talk, you could swear that he was well educated, but never completed, any sort of higher education, despite having a full ride scholarship to Harvard.
Wow.
He was like, nah, I'm going to go do a tour of Europe and, go homeless in Ireland instead. But
much better education.
Right. That's exactly the thing. That his life is just fascinating, right? These are just a few of the stories I could get into. I could do so much more that I've uncovered for my research, but he just lived a life. Yeah. And that ultimately is the most profound thing I have learned that an artist can do to become better at their art, is live life. I used to be very skeptical of that idea because I think I'm very introverted by nature. And I think when I was young, right, I heard a lot of writing advice from writers who kind of basically said that, right? Like the more you know, the more life experience you have to draw on, the better of a writer you're going to be. And I was kind of chafed at that when I was younger because I was very introverted, very shy. And I was like, no, all you need is imagination. And to a certain extent, I still believe that's true. However, it is also proven to me to be true as I've grown in life experiences, as I've matured, and as I've had all sorts of adventures, that these are things that have refined my art and refined the amount of things that I have to say that are substantive. Yeah. And it's the more I realize that that is true, and that doesn't necessarily mean you have to re-engineer your whole personality, because I've remained very introverted. But there are ways for anybody to experience adventures, to have deep relationships and connections, and to just do crazy stuff in your own way. And I think I've kind of found my way of doing that in some of the travel and adventures that I've had in recent years. And so, as well as with you and some of the absolute craziness that we've been through in recent years, just relationally and with all sorts of interpersonal stuff, that all that stuff just forms you, and it adds to your life experience and adds to your empathy, because again, a lot of it is inherently relational. And that was the case with Orson Welles. I think he showed me how living life, right, living a large life and having a wide breadth of experiences is the ultimate artist's education, and how that led to just incredible brilliance in his craft. So that's Orson Welles for me.
Absolutely. Because you can survive entirely off of your own imagination. However, more life experiences gives you a larger palette to paint from, if you will, right? You can have a fantastic imagination and a very limited palette to use, and you can basically create the same story as many different times as you can. But if you want to have a varied palette, a varied amount of different stories and worldviews and everything to draw from, you need that life experience to be able to draw from it at all. Because if you've never experienced it, you don't know what you haven't experienced.
Yeah, exactly. And I think another thing about Orson Welles that I'll leave briefly to kind of conclude his note is, we didn't even get to talking about his films. Right? Like, he was...
That's all secondary.
I know, that's all secondary to the larger than life character that was Orson Welles, which was like, his life was really his greatest performance. But he just was a profoundly great filmmaker with a very distinctive style that revolutionized the way we imagine film, right? He basically invented modern film. He very much was at the forerunner of the noir movement in the West, and in America in particular. And he brought a lot of his theater comrades into film and a lot of his radio comrades into film. And he just knew how to work with people. Like, he worked with a lot of the same people, right, over the course of his career, and he developed strong relationships with them, which is also another valuable lesson as an artist. But like, Citizen Kane, no doubt, is a masterpiece, right? There's a reason it's considered one of the greatest films ever made. But the way he went about it, right? It was his first feature film. And he knew nothing about film going into it. And I remember an interviewer asking him, how did he pull it off? One of the greatest films ever made. And his answer was sheer ignorance. And that's
the best
something
way
that
to approach it.
And because he didn't know what not to do.
Yeah, he didn't understand the conventions at the time.
Exactly. He had no sense of film convention and thus was able to break the rules so creatively that because he didn't know not to question certain things.
Yeah.
And he was doing so many things.
He was given the tools, but not the process.
Yeah. And that in and of itself is very brilliant and very inspiring to me, that not knowing what rules to break is what made him such a innovator in film. And he was working with a great cinematographer on Citizen Kane, who he said, again, he didn't know what was impossible. He didn't know that he was asking his cinematographer to do things that cinematographers previously considered impossible. Yeah. And he is like, I love the way he worded it. It was like, he never conveyed to us that he was doing miracles, and yet he routinely did. Because he didn't know that he was asking him to do very unorthodox things, and he was just like, yeah, I could do that. And so but yeah, that was just the way that production operated, and it's utterly innovative for its time, and just pioneered all sorts of film techniques that are now more standard practice. And that's been something that's been true in my experience, is the fact that I always feel like the less I know, the more creative I am. Because really, even when I look at some of my earlier work, I could cringe at the craftsmanship, but there's still such an innovation to it by virtue of me not knowing the conventions.
Just throwing stuff out there and seeing what sticks.
And sometimes you could get locked into those conventions when you have a better understanding of the theory. And for me, I'm always trying to walk a careful tightrope about that now, of having open imagination with strong craftsmanship. And I think that's ultimately what Wells developed, and all of his films are really brilliant.
Yeah. And also just putting this out there as well for people who are listening to this and wanting to become artists, or who are on the journey of the artist. It is important to know that Orson Welles was actually a genius. So that might not be the best way to go at it, is just to hit it with pure unbridled ignorance, and it'll work itself out in the end. Because one of my favorite quotes of just in general artists is, you have to know the conventions in order to break them, right? You have to study why things are done before you can turn that on its head and say, I'm going to break this so that I can get a different feel out of it. He knew what he wanted. He was already an artist. He was just bringing that into a different medium.
Yeah, because he'd already mastered like 3 different kinds of storytelling before that, right? So
basically, right?
He wasn't coming in exactly fresh.
Yeah, he already knew how he wanted to tell the story. He was just now doing this in a different medium, and therefore he could take his storytelling ability, apply it to these new tools, not knowing that within these tools, there was already a process that was established that he, quote unquote, should be following to, I guess, get the best results, the most consistent result. But he wasn't looking for that. He wasn't looking for making a film in a studio to, become an advert for a theater, right? That's basically what films are. They're adverts for theaters. He wasn't looking for that. He was trying to create a story. He was trying to create a piece of
art.
Oh, well, I'd say a piece of cinema, but like I don't think that was like a term at the time. He was just making like at least how we currently describe a piece of cinema, right?
Yeah.
But that's what he was trying to do, and he just used film to tell his story. He already knew how to tell it. He already knew what he wanted to say. He was just now using film and actors, which was only very slightly different, I guess, to theater and actors.
Yeah. And also just it's to say nothing too about his theater career, where he did very innovative stuff as well. One of the first things he did when he was doing the federal theater program was he developed a run of Macbeth using an all black cast, and like that, just crazy stuff like that for the time that, he was doing. Right. Keep in mind, this was like 1940s. So it's you're right, like absolutely crazy. And so, and to say nothing of him as an actor too, I haven't even gotten into that. Hands down, one of my favorite actors of all time. He could deliver a monologue like nobody's business, and apparently was a brilliant sight reader, which was a habit he developed in radio because he was so busy and would often have very little to no time to do his sessions. So he had to do everything in one take, but brilliant actor. Yeah.
And all of those skills to be just condensed into one person is a powerhouse of an individual.
Absolutely. Yeah. Insane.
You'd be lucky to get one of those skills normally.
Yeah, right. Definitely why he is on my short list of creative heroes.
Absolutely. I don't know him well enough for him to be on my list. So I would love to do a follow-up episode of this, of just you talking about Orson Welles and all his craziness, because I just want to hear it. I love it. Like all this stuff. I'm like, this sounds like my guy. This sounds like my ideal human being.
He really kind of was.
And he was a magician too.
Yeah. And the fact that he was a magician. If he was an athlete, he would probably be like your ultimate.
If he wasn't so paunched.
Yeah. He definitely got thicker the older he got, but
yeah. Well, you know, he aged like a fine wine.
Certainly.
More body.
Certainly. He also started advertising wine in his later years. So, so what's your final category?
My final category is, I actually don't have very many individuals in this category because it's filmmakers as a whole. And of course, you just talked about Orson Welles. And basically, all of the reasons why I have filmmakers in here is because a filmmaker is one of my ideal forms of like storytelling, because it is simultaneously a singular person's vision. The director has basically not sole decisions of like sole creative decisions, but you need that one person in charge to say, here's the direction we're going to go, right? Mm-hmm. While being inherently
collective. Yeah.
Yeah, being inherently dependent on collaboration, because you can make a film all on your own. This is very true. There are several films made entirely by one person, one actor, one camera, one director. Yeah, sure, it's been done. However, if you want to tell a great story, you need multiple perspectives. You need to bring in somebody who is not who doesn't share the same beliefs as you, or to share the same like just vision as you, to come in and say, hey, here's how this could be better. Let's take this writing up a notch, or let's shoot this from a different angle. What if we change the lighting, right? They're inherently collaborative, creative decisions always make a better film. Mm-hmm. There are tons of directors, or there are tons of actors, there are tons of like producers who I can cite as being like, oh yeah, these are my favorite. But all for the same reasons, is because they have a good singular vision to tell a story. This is a film, it's about this. And then taking it to people, collaborating and saying, how could we make this better? And of course, I realize, again, with like comic book artists doing the same thing, it's all kind of tying into the same reason why I like that kind of storytelling. I had forgotten about comic book artists when I was constructing this list, but for the same reasons,
right?
You have this singular, the person who is leading the project saying, this is what I want to, this is the story I want to tell, bringing artists in to help them tell that story, and then it becoming a better project because of that, because of bringing in somebody else.
Yeah, that's true. So it's just like, I think really what you're getting at is you love those multidisciplinary mediums.
Yes.
Yeah,
and you hit the nail on the head when you said he was a polymath. To be a filmmaker, you have to be a polymath as well. A good filmmaker, I should say, because you have to have your toes in all the
different departments.
Pies, right? Yeah,
that's true. And it is inherently a collective effort, while also having, like you said, this sense of singular direction or vision, right? There's still leadership in the structure, but it is inherently collective otherwise. And it is that combination of so many different skills, so many different trades, so many different crafts, and all coming together of so many different artists making creative decisions that lead to a greater whole. And that's really what the most brilliant films are made out of.
Yeah. So that's basically it. Like just filmmakers in general. Like you can take your entire spiel about Orson Welles and say, for filmmakers, that's mine.
There we go.
Because it's that kind of a person. Mm-hmm. That's the artist that I consider to be like my creative heroes, is the filmmaker who is a multidisciplinary artist who has a strong singular vision and works well with other people.
Mm-hmm. So last on my list, and last of our podcast, which I know we've gone a little long on this one, but I think it's fitting given the breadth of our topic.
Thankfully, not too long.
Not too long. C.S. Lewis. So
yes, another person I'm interested in that I don't know too much about other than what you've told me.
Yeah. So C.S. Lewis, I think I kind of got more into C.S. Lewis as I was kind of in my late teens going into my early adulthood, when I really came to find my love of C.S. Lewis. And he's notably, I consider myself first and foremost a writer. I'm engaged in many different disciplines of art. However, I would consider myself foremost a writer. It was my first love as far as the arts go. And it's still the thing that I've come to accept I identify most with if I had to choose an artistic identity. And that being said, like C.S. Lewis notably is like the only like pure prose writer on this list, right? And so like And I think there's good reason for that, because he kind of stands out to me in a lot of ways. Obviously, through Narnia, like he had a kind of spot in everybody's childhood to some extent. But
Right.
But even beyond that, right? I think as I was really coming into my faith in my late teens, I encountered his nonfiction work as well. And his nonfiction work is equally brilliant and imaginative. I once heard him described as having, like, his nonfiction work described as having like a razor sharp logic without discounting the essential nature of the imagination and the affections in the Christian life. And that's really, I think that's a very succinct way of describing it. I would agree with that description. His nonfiction was just brilliant. Like the way he wrote about faith and the way he condensed in, the way he viewed it, right? Like he had, in some ways, a very unconventional way of portraying it, but in a way that kind of, right, like notably, we don't know very much about how he read his Bible, because we don't know what his study notes were like, and he very rarely cites scripture in his nonfiction. At the same time, he has this way of abstracting it and getting down to the essential nature of what the faith is. And so brilliant nonfiction writer in that regard, as far as like spiritual literature, but also just in his fiction. The fact that he was a fiction writer at all, first off, is pretty amazing. Not a lot of Christians choose to go that path. And in fact, in some circles, if you're in very conservative circles, there are like, that's very much frowned upon, in fact. But with him and Tolkien, right, we're obviously both very prominent Christian fiction writers in their era, and we're very close friends as it happens. But he very much inspired me as a creative of faith, and showed me an example and a model of what that can look like. And I think of all artists, he's, I think, the one that I look to as being what I most aspire to be like, in terms of his lifestyle and the way
and how he just lived.
Yeah, how he lived,
how he approached life.
Yeah, and how he approached his art, and how, like, what purpose art served in his life, and what and the way he integrated his art and his faith in a way that made them both better, right? Like his stories deal with allegory in a way that I think is brilliant, and that combines the best of both worlds, right? Of his faith and his storytelling in a way that doesn't diminish both of them. Because there are ways of doing that that can end up like diminishing it, right? That can make like your art worse, or that can basically, because there's a difference between like a sermon and a story. They have to serve very different functions.
For sure.
And I think he strikes that balance carefully, and yet in a way that doesn't compromise the essential message and themes of his faith, and in a way that doesn't compromise the story either. And by virtue of the fact that it is enjoyed by lots of people of different faiths and secular beliefs.
Yeah, what you're saying is he's good at preaching without being preachy.
Essentially, yeah. But I mean, what is a good preacher but a good storyteller? I think more people should understand that too. Yeah. But like absolutely brilliant artist, but really most of all, a really strong model for me of what a Christian artist can be like, who uses storytelling towards that end, and as a part of one's calling and faith. Yeah, and absolutely. That's kind of C.S. Lewis for me. And I still have a lot to explore in his body of work. I haven't read most of his books. I definitely want to read his science fiction trilogy, because I'm a bigger sci-fi nerd than I am a fantasy nerd. So it's kind of a shame that I've read his Narnia books, but not his science fiction. So his space trilogy.
I didn't know he had that. I think you told me, but
yeah, he had a space trilogy, and that apparently is also very fantastic. So I definitely have to get into that stuff. But like, there's still a lot left I have to explore of him. But just as a person, and know what I know about his life and his character, he is very much a model for me, and including in the way he just approaches relationships. The fact that he had a close relationship with J.R.R. Tolkien, who, even though they were both Christians, were profoundly in disagreement, right, in the way they practice their belief, right? Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and C.S. Lewis more on the kind of Protestant, Western evangelical side, but they had a lot of profound disagreements, and yet had a deep friendship and a deep kinship in their tenures at Oxford, and kind of and were just both brilliant intellectuals as well, right? Who had a lot of apparently their own kind of inner circle of intellectuals. I forgot what they called their group, but that would gather at Oxford and talk about
the circle, the range,
something to that effect.
The fellowship.
But and just apparently enjoyed really engaging intellectual conversations, which to me is just the spice of life. So also very much influential in that regard, and just his personality and the kind of life he liked to live intellectually.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you need to surround yourself with intellectuals who disagree with you. That's just a check that everybody needs to have.
Absolutely.
Especially if you are in the practice of increasing your knowledge of the world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's why that's kind of long been a policy for us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why we're still friends.
That's fair. So to wrap things up, those were our creative heroes.
Although I think I have a hidden last.
Oh,
if I just may, to close the podcast episode off on this, I have a hidden last set of people who are my creative heroes. Secret final, and that is you and my partner.
Aw,
really, I'm not joking. You two. Watching people that I love create art, it just, it hits home, right? It's just like, I can create art in a vacuum all I want, but and I can do it as an art form, but watching people that I love create things that I'm like, you made that? That's freaking cool. That's really why I want to surround myself with those kind of people, and surrounding myself with artists, the people that I love, those are my heroes.
Aww. Well, that was unexpected. And I think I could also definitely say the same, though, because, not mentioned on this list also is you, and also your partner, and also my partner. Like, watching people you love create is something special, and there's really nothing else like it. But especially with you and me, we've been together our whole lives. I say together, we've been in contact, but
well, I've been with you your whole life.
That is also very true. You spent 2 years without me, but the fact that we kind of were formed together, right? Which is why we have a lot of overlapping tastes. You have been a constant push and inspiration for me in a lot of ways. And that's something that I can't easily discount. And a large part of why I keep creating and why I decided to go into creative lifestyle and career is in large part because of the fact that we were always pushing each other in that direction and enabling that. And ultimately, I think that's kind of part of why we've made it our mission at P-Cube to enable artists, is because that's really paying forward, I think, what we gave each other, because you were my ultimate enabler.
Sorry.
Of art. I should qualify.
Yeah. There's a lot of stories I can tell of just the memories that I have growing up of just creating these, honestly, pretty bad comics and little stories and little things that we would make up, that eventually would kind of lead to our love of D&D as well.
Yeah.
Of just making things up on the spot.
Yeah. We had very structured make-believe. I remember when we were kids.
We did.
And that no doubt is the reason why we jived with tabletop RPGs so quick.
Yeah. Just hit it. And we're like, oh, this was it. We found it. We found the rule set that we've been looking for.
Yeah. Essentially.
But you, my partner, those are even more so than anybody that I would never meet are my creative heroes.
Aw. Yeah. Well, on that note, and as well, I think, again, enabling artists is also a powerful mission of ours. And that's kind of why I think we wanted to delve into this topic, is to not only, talk about that, but the artists that inspired us from a distance, and who inspired us and enabled us to create by their example and by their lifestyle. And that's one thing I didn't get into as much with Maniom, was the fact that he was a great enabler of artists, which is, I think, one of the hugest points of respect for me. There are so many anecdotes from all sorts of artists all across the industry whose lives were touched by personal encounters with Maniom, where he very powerfully enabled them. And he just was always generous with his time and resources and knowledge, and just really inspired a new generation, ourselves included. And I think it would be appropriate to also note of like his personal life, of just how wholesome and upstanding of a person he was to the people that he encountered and to everybody. He just had apparently this positivity that radiated from him. And there was a motto of his that kind of became a pretty widespread saying after his untimely death that I think would be a fitting term to close this episode on, which he simply was fond of saying, keep moving forward. And that's ultimately what we've got to keep doing as artists and in our lives and in our relationships, and always maintaining what's good about what's there, but not necessarily having a mind for regrets or looking back and seeing what else we could improve, because the future is our chance at improvement. And so keep moving forward.
Absolutely.
So that being said, this has been the premiere season 2 episode of the Hypercube podcast.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for listening. This show is edited by Loryn Pacheco, mixed by Raphael Pacheco, with original theme music by Mono Memory. Until next time, we'll see y'all later. God bless.
Adios.